Okay, so I figured that since I did Gandiva, I might as well take a look at another top tier deck. So let's go over Wilista. I do think that Wilista is much less of a problem in the meta. Even though Wilista can pour out a massive amount of power and draws a tons of cards to sustain itself, it's much more of a piece reliant deck, and its power levels are determined by the cards that it's able to draw. Of course, the deck itself has a lot of built-in consistency, which is really what makes it so strong. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the deck, what makes it good, and how you can beat it. So as always, let's go ahead and start with the ride line. So Wilista's ride line has two effects that are both relevant when you're riding to grade 2. When the grade 2 Wilista is placed over the grade 1, you can put a card from your hand to soul in order to search out a gem card. So the card the deck is searching out is this one, the double gem. We'll talk more about what this card does later, but for now, just note that when you play it, it goes to soul, it draws you a card, and it gives your Vanguard an extra 5k. At this time, the grade 2 skill activates. Since you played a gem, you draw another card. So effectively it turns the gem into a pot of greed. So in summary, the ride line results in a +2 to soul and a +1 to hand. Remember that the search is 1 for 1 and then you -1 to +2. So let's go over a Wilista skill. When she's placed, you can discard a card to add a gem card from your drop or soul to hand. This effectively means that so long as Wilista keeps re-riding, they will always have access to a gem. That is, if they don't just draw into a new one. The second skill is a bit more relevant as it lets you Soul Blast a gem and activates the effects depending on which one you choose. Since the only gem that you play in the deck already counts as both, we're just going to treat it as one effect. So first you get an extra 15k to the Vanguard. This combined with the gem order means that Wilista herself is usually at 33k on her own. Second, you get to check the top 5 cards of your deck and call up to 2 from among them. These two skills together make up the bulk of the reason why Wilista is so good. You build board, which means you don't have to commit cards from hand. That, along with the amount of draw power the deck has, means that Wilista's hands get very big, very quickly. So having a great Vanguard is pretty important, but the rear guards are just as important. Let's start off with the support cards. So first off, we have Elevira. It's a pretty simple skill. It lets you draw an extra card when you play your gem. Do note that the skill stacks, so the more that are on board, the more cards get drawn. Next up, we have the Lyrical Cycle card. This card pulls double duty in this deck as it can be discarded for Wilista's skill and proc its own effect since the skill activates during the ride phase. Additionally, the skill to add an extra 5k to the front row is extremely deadly as it makes magic numbers like 28 and 35. Next, let's take a look at the attackers of the deck. We'll start off with Ramona. She has a very simple skill that gives her an extra 10k if you manage to play both gems in a turn. Previously, this was gimmicky and kind of terrible, but now that we have a gem that counts as both, her skill will almost always be live. Next up, we have Ophelia. This one is a little more complex, but still not too bad. Her skill is activated at the end of the battle that your Vanguard attacks. The effects depend on the gem cards you Soul Blasted or play this turn, but since we only have the double gem, both effects are always going to be active. So firstly, she gains 15k, and secondly, you can CB1 and bot deck your rear guard in the center column to re-stand her. Then the deck gets shuffled. So you can really only stand one Ophelia with their own skill once per turn, but do note that Ophelias always get the 15k after the Vanguard attacks, so long as you use the gem. So max 4 attacks? That doesn't really sound too bad. Well, now is the time we take a look at the double gem card again. Aside from being treated as both and the extra 5k in draw, it does actually give your Vanguard a skill as well. During the turn that you played the gem, when your Wilista attacks a grade 3 Vanguard, you can Counterblast one and Soul Blast a grade 3 Wilista to re-stand one of your rear guards. Most of the time this condition will be met on turn 4 after a Persona ride, but if you go second, you could theoretically do it on turn 3, but only if you put a Persona ride into Soul with the grade 1 skill. So on a good turn, Wilista reaches 5 attacks, usually under Persona ride. Number 1. What are the numbers? So an ideal Wilista board is usually going to comprise of 1 Ophelia, 1 Ramona, and then 2 boosters for each rear guard. Of course, they will also need something behind the Vanguard, but most of the time it's irrelevant what it is. A turn 3 can vary depending on the player and matchup, but I think for the purpose of this analysis, we're just going to take a look at the typical turn 4. So if we start off with Persona Ride, we get our ideal board setup. We're looking at 5 attacks with really big numbers. The first 2 attacks come from Ophelia and Ramona. These will be at 23 or 31 or 36 if they choose to boost the first attack for the Ophelia, and then 30 or 38 to 43 with the boost for Ramona. As a Wilista player myself, I personally think that boosting the first swing is kind of a mistake in most situations, but each player is different. Next up is the Vanguard, which would be swinging for around 43 at the minimum and up to 51 at the max. By the end of the attack, both rearguards are going to be standing, and 2 more attacks that are going to be around 46 to 51, or 38 without the boost, and 38 to 53, or 43, excuse me, or 30 without the boost. So let's do the numbers and calculate how much shield you would need to theoretically survive this turn. So we're going to assume no triggers or PGs in this situation, and I'm going to calculate based on what I personally think the optimal Wilista turn is. So theoretically, if you had 8 cards with a perfect amount of shield value, you could get away with only using 8 cards. I say that as if 8 cards isn't a huge toll on literally any deck. Thankfully, you don't have to worry about guarding everything thanks to 2 little things, PGs and taking damage. When taking on this deck, you have to think about the best way to guard, how you can maximize your shield and your PGs. I think I heard this from another YouTuber's video, but this is the advice I tend to follow for some of my games. You should always treat taking damage as a PG. It really makes a lot of sense. No matter how big a unit's power gets, taking the attack invalidates it. A unit with 13k power and a unit with 100 million power do the same amount of base damage. So as with regular Vanguard, you need to guard early and ensure that you can take damage during Wilista push turn. My advice is to be able to take 2 to 3 damage, guard the smaller swings, and don't bank on defensives. The Vanguard swing is usually the most threatening, so you want to put yourself into a situation where you can safely take it. So you want to play out the game to a situation where you're at 2 to 3 damage, that way you won't lose to a single critical trigger. Number 2, managing the flow of the game. So one of the most difficult parts about facing off against Wilista is managing the game's flow. As we've seen, Wilista is good at all stages of the game, primarily from early to mid game. But unlike Gandiva, Wilista is much weaker during the end game, but depending on the flow of the game, they can still easily close things out, as they've likely exhausted most of your defensive resources throughout the game. Let's break down how you should handle each turn. Instead of going through each scenario for going first or second, I'm going to break it down by the grade attacks. So on grade 1, if the Wilista player rushes on a grade 1, it's usually because they fear the end game of your deck and want to close things out quickly. To accomplish this, most likely they're going to be calling a Yuika and sometimes an Elevira. You always want to guard the Vanguard when they're attacking with a grade 1. Use a 15k shield. Don't bet on them not hitting a trigger. This is the only time that you can really safely hard guard the Vanguard. If they call an Elevira, make sure you make killing it your top priority. She contributes to the draw power of the deck, and after this turn, she'll probably move to the back row. So unless you have access to retire, this is your only chance to get her off board. And don't bother attacking into you because they're really not that important. Grade 2. So the attack pattern is usually a 15k Vanguard and either 1 or 2 20k Ramonas. You should never guard this Vanguard attack unless you have a 1 card 20k shield, which is probably going to be those counter heals, which I don't really think you should be running at this time. A good player will swing Vanguard first since any Ramonas hit past the defensive, so I would always take the Vanguard swing, and from there are 4 possible scenarios. So first, the Vanguard can hit a trigger and you don't. We're going to treat just having 1 Ramona for these situations, so there's going to be a Ramona at 30k, and it's a 25k guard, which is always going to be 2 cards, so I wouldn't bother guarding that, just take the 2 damage. So the second scenario, Vanguard hits a trigger, and so do you. Ramona is at 30k, and you're going to be at either 18 or 20. I would commit the extra 15k guard to keep yourself at low damage, and hope they didn't actually hit a critical trigger. So third scenario, Vanguard hits no trigger, and you don't either. So Ramona is at 20k, and you can still commit a 15k shield to guard it, which I would recommend doing. And the fourth scenario, Vanguard hits a trigger, or Vanguard doesn't hit a trigger, and you do. So the Ramona is still going to be at 20k, but you'll also be at either 18 or 20k. So I would commit just a 5k shield to guard. You want to keep your damage low. So when you have to deal with multiple Ramona, try and guard the 2 rear swings if you can. If you don't have enough shields to guard both of the attacks, then I would take the Vanguard and the first rear guard, hoping for defensives. And grade 3. The first grade 3 turn is the easiest to manage. The max attacks is usually about 4, and they don't hit as hard without the Persona Ride. So the first attack is probably an Ophelia, which is going to be 13k to 26k. This is the easiest guard, so I would always recommend guarding this attack. Second is the Vanguard. It hits 33 unboosted, so either you take this attack or PG it. Hopefully you've managed the early game well so that you're still at low damage. I would recommend guarding this attack if you can, so you can take more attacks during the next turn safely, but it's not a huge deal. The third attack will be Ramona, which will be swinging at either 20 to 28k depending on if they have a booster. If this attack is at 20, it should be an easy guard, but if she reaches 28k, then you'll need a front trigger. I would recommend committing it if you can, but if you can't, it's alright too. The final attack will be the Ophelia again, who is now at 28k. Depending on whether they boosted the first attack, this attack will be either 28 to 41k. Number 3. Weaknesses. So, unlike Gandiva, Wilista actually has quite a few weaknesses you can exploit in order to ensure that their turns aren't as powerful as they could be. Firstly, we have the fact that the deck has no way to recycle pieces. Wilista draws a ton of cards and calls from the top 5, so a majority of the time they have access to almost any piece that they need or can call replacements. In this sense, taking out their board isn't always enough to defeat them. Instead, you should keep track of the number of pieces that are already out of the deck. Before attacking or retiring Ophelias, check to see how many are already out of the game. Chances are, the Wilista player will be able to call replacement, and you'll miss out on dealing damage or chipping away at their hand. Ophelias are prime targets to retire, but if your deck has spot removal, you might want to aim for any Elviras in the back row. Each one represents another card drawn each turn, and getting rid of them slows down their advantage engine. The other, more exploitable weakness is their inability to countercharge at all. Outside of healing, the Wilista player has to finish a game only using 5 CB. Each CB you give to the Wilista player represents another attack that you have to deal with. If you can't close out a game, there's no reason to give them more than one open CB. When Wilista only has 1 CB, they need to decide which restand to use and max out at 4 attacks. In these cases, be wary of Ophelias, since they can become strong attackers even without the CB. A good Wilista player will be able to relegate the amount of damage they take, but keep in mind how much damage they're at and make the choices difficult for them. So that's really all there is to it. Wilista is a strong deck, but not unbeatable. If you go into the matchup guns blazing, not paying attention to what's happening, you're probably going to lose. If you play smart and know what you're doing, you shouldn't have too hard of time beating the deck. Of course, there is always the variability of triggers, which I really didn't go over too much, but, you know, that's all part of Vanguard. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I do have plans to try and keep working on this, but with set 11 coming out, we do have a lot of testing to do. I've got to see how the new decks play, and I want to just like collect more data and try and figure out what the best ways to beat them are before I make a video on it. So the next one might take a little bit while, but I'll continue with the regular content. But anyways, if you did enjoy, go ahead and do all those YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.